Okay, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started because we do have kind of a tight agenda today. So, welcome to this session, Zombies or, let's see, just kidding, it's e-resources. So sorry for the shameless title to try to get people into the session. Thank you all for attending today. My name is Joe Marciniak, and I'm the Electronic Resources Librarian at Princeton University. And I wanted to just talk a little bit briefly about our session goals today. So this session is designed for people who have no background in e-resources or maybe just a little bit. And what we want to do today is kind of provide a comprehensive overview of all of the aspects of an e-resources librarians or ERLs responsibilities. The idea being that this is going to give you a really broad overview of what's entailed with the responsibilities, and then you can identify some areas that you might need to do a deeper dive into on your own. A little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm going to be drawing on examples today from three institutions. One institution was a small private college of only about 1,000 students. And then I was at a mid-sized public university, about 14,000 students, and I'm at a private institution again, but with about 8,000 students. And the reason why this is going to be important is because you're going to see that these roles that you have as an ERL change greatly based on the institution that you have, the resources that are available to you, and the workflows that are in place at each of those institutions. Just to tell you about the agenda really quickly, again, we do have a full close to 30 minutes. I will try to end early with some Q&A, but I'm going to put my email at the end of the presentation, and also I will look at the chat. I will get back to anybody with questions they have, but I do just let you know we've got a lot of content here today. So we're going to talk about the e-resources lifecycle, the collection development responsibilities of the ERL, managing access issues, negotiating licenses, payment and technical setup, maintenance and renewal, and also job profiles and interviews. Some of those things that you need to look for when you look at a profile, and some good questions to ask during an interview that will help you determine if it's the right fit for you or not. So the first thing that I want to introduce everyone to is the e-resources lifecycle. I have uploaded 2 documents that you should all be able to download in the Pathable module or platform. This is one of them. You can also find this on the web. But the e-resources lifecycle is very important. And the main reason is because this exists independently of the institution that you're at. So I just showed 3 very different institutions, but the only thing that's going to change is how you get these things done. So as the e-resources librarian, it's going to be your responsibility to make sure that all of these stages, there's only 5 stages, but you can see that each one of these stages has many, many sub-stages to it. And so the nice thing is that this doesn't change no matter where you are. And if you're a new e-resources librarian, you can actually just use this as a checklist as you move through the acquisitions process. So this is a very useful diagram, and it's still very accurate, even though it's from 2009. So again, this doesn't change dependent, it's not institution dependent, and it's a great checklist for new e-resources librarians. I've also uploaded another document, which is the core competencies for e-resources librarians from NASIG. This is a free document that you can download. I really recommend that if you're interested in this line of work that you read this document. It really kind of outlines all the things that will be expected of you as an e-resources librarian, something that you can be confident that you'll need to know to work in this field. So I highly recommend that. Download it here. If you're having any issues with it, you can just go to the NASIG website, go to publications, and then you'll see core competencies, and you can find the one for e-resources librarians. So going back to the e-resources lifecycle here, and you can see that it's very complicated, and the workflow is going to depend heavily on the institution. So if you're at a very small institution, for example, like my first one, where maybe there's only 1,000 students, maybe you only have 2 or 3 librarians in the library, then you're going to be responsible personally for many of those steps. If you're working at a larger institution, it's likely that you'll be working with a group, you'll be working with different departments, but it still is your responsibility as the ERL to make sure that all of these stages are processed correctly. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at the size of the library or the size of the institution, how much hands-on you'll have with it versus how much kind of management of the project you'll have with it. So I just wanted to do a quick example, and I'm looking at just the acquiring stage, and you can see that it's only one stage, but it has 7 sub stages. So what I did is I went through and I sort of made a list of all of the people who are involved with each one of these stages with me. And this is right now at my current institution. And you can see that it gets quite complicated. These are all people or different departments that you're working with. And one thing to note in particular on here is that you might be working with departments outside of the library. So you're not even working with library colleagues on some of these. If you're working with a campus IT department, even a library IT department, you're going to be working with the legal department. You're going to be in contact with the finance and the budgeting department. So again, you're managing this really complicated structure. And this leads me to the next slide, which is the technical knowledge and skills are really important to be an e-resources librarian. But I've found that people kind of assume this is sort of the main thing that e-resources librarians deal with. But when I made a list of kind of the things that I do or the skills that I use the most on a daily basis, you're going to see some that are like problem solving, organization, independent learning, communication. And you're saying, well, these are necessary skills for any profession, any professional job. And I'm not debating that. I'm just reinforcing that it's also a really important part of the ERL's job. I've talked to some people who are kind of interested in it because they think that it's going to be a little bit more of an isolated tech kind of job. But really the problem solving skills, you're going to be helping patrons, faculty, students solve issues. They don't have access issues. You're going to be working with vendor tech support to resolve things. That life cycle is so complicated that you're going to have to stay really, really well organized. Independent learning, you're dealing with multiple vendors, different formats. You're going to need to be able to digest like thick text heavy documents, synthesize information and make it useful. And then, communication again is so essential because of the fact that you will be working, you're the hub of this right here. So even if you're not responsible for every single one of these every single one of these stages, you are going to be responsible for moving it from one stage to the next. For example, if the invoice gets paid, you then have to pick up the process and move on to the next step. So you need to be really well organized and communicate very well with people over the phone, via email, clear, concise communication. Again, these are things that would be obvious, but I like to stress it when talking about the ERL's responsibilities because they kind of get overlooked a lot of times, I think. And then the main thing you need is a ton of determination. And the reason why I bring that up is because these stages are such that it will stop if you don't keep moving it forward. So the example I just gave, the finance department gets the invoice, you provide the funding code for it, they pay it, they're done. They're not checking back in, and they shouldn't be, to see if you have now added that resource and made it available to patrons. So that's something that you would have to continue on. So being determined is just kind of something that I like to stress and emphasize. You're going to get really tired of working on some of these acquisitions. They go on for hundreds of emails, and you just have to stick with it. I want to jump right into the collection development responsibilities of the ERL. You can see that I've listed several aspects over here: identifying the need, working with vendors, establishing and evaluating a trial. You got to negotiate the price, then the license, process the payment, establish access, analyze usage, and continue to provide support. So this is a lot of work for one person to do. So what you need to do is get more people to help you with it. Now, obviously, everybody has their own job descriptions, but you're going to find that there's overlap between what you're doing and what other people are doing at your institution. And you're also going to find that other people are really interested in some aspects of e-resources, particularly identifying e-resources, evaluating them, and then also the usage statistics here. A lot of people are really interested in looking at usage, interested in tracking trends. And so you're going to want to identify people. At a previous institution we formed a collection development committee. People served on the committee for 2 years, and we just tried to get people representing different disciplines on that committee. And then we were getting feedback. We could get feedback from them as well. And it's going to be really important when you're talking about evaluating packages and resources themselves, we'll get to in a little bit. So ebooks kind of necessitates its own slide here when you're talking about collection development, because a lot of times e-resources are sold as ebooks are sold as large packages, or you can do kind of an a la carte thing. One thing to be aware of is DDA, which stands for demand driven acquisition. You also might hear PDA, which is patron driven acquisition. And this is when your patrons are actually going to make purchases for you on your behalf. So you would load records into your catalog provided by a vendor, and then based on certain criteria or parameters like how long they spend in an ebook, how many clicks, that would actually trigger a purchase for the library. So here you're directly involving your patrons with collection development. EBA, which is an evidence-based acquisition model. This is kind of a little bit of DDA and a little bit of oversight. So this works basically like you agree on a certain spend with a vendor. Let's say ProQuest is an example. So you say, we're going to spend in 2021, we're going to spend $15,000 on ebooks with you, and we're interested in an EBA model. What that usually entails is that the vendor will then open up many more ebooks, like a whole pool, a whole catalog of ebooks, and your patrons can use any of them throughout the year. And then at the end of the agreed upon cycle, you will look at usage statistics from those ebooks, and then you will be able to decide which ones you want to purchase. And this is useful because maybe patrons triggered ebooks that you already have good coverage in, and you think, no, we don't really need that. So this is kind of a nice sort of middle ground where you get to see usage, your patrons get access to a large pool of ebooks, but at the end of the day, you get to make the decision on which ones you're going to have and purchase for perpetual access. Streaming media, I'm sure there's a bunch of sessions that are completely dedicated to streaming media. So I just wanted to say something really quickly. You can see that there's the major vendors are listed here across the top, but I also wanted to point out that, you have the ability, if you're working with production companies and suppliers, to host and provide access to content yourself. So this is an example of a DVD, of a documentary that we recently acquired directly from the production company. We negotiated the rights, and then we use a company called NJ Edge, which hosts it for us. But you can also host it internally on a server by working with the IT department. Basically, as long as you put the resource behind your authentication system, you can host these yourself. This is nothing that you would want to do with too many titles, because it's a lot of maintenance on your part, which is why we have a lot of vendors to work for. But it's just something that I like to add when we're talking about streaming media, is that you're essentially still talking about just providing a product and a resource. And if you can host it, you can build a link to it and make it available to your patrons as well. So when I talk about collection development, I think of a very specific way that e-resources librarians can add value. One of the challenges of being an ERL is that you're kind of format oriented. So your format touches all of the disciplines, but sometimes that can get a little bit confusing because you're not actually supposed to be an expert in all of those disciplines. And I want to reiterate that you shouldn't feel like you are either. And that's where we'll talk about in a minute that you need to recruit help. But because your format, electronic, accessing it off campus, accessing it on the web, you're going to see that in biology, you're going to see it in history, you're going to see it in English. So I wouldn't focus too much on being able to evaluate the quality of the content. That's what you want to get feedback from faculty for, subject specialists, library liaisons. But what you want to be able to do is provide a lot of overlap analysis. So overlap analysis is, if you're looking at a journal package, you want to be able to say you want to be able to accurately say what percent of the journals in this package are unique content. It's never going to be 100%, or it's likely not going to be 100%. So you can do the overlap analysis yourself with Excel, but I also ask vendors to provide it a lot. If it's a large vendor, they'll be able to provide any kind of overlap. Yes, where you're looking at this new journal package, 80% of the journal titles are unique to this package, meaning they're not held in any of the other ones that you have, because that's going to be really important. You don't want to be duplicating access too much. Impact factors, if you're looking to add a new journal, it's always good to have access to citation indexes so that you can see how impactful those journals are in the profession. If a journal is being cited all of the time in a certain discipline, then that's a good indicator that you need to add it as a subscription at your institution. So embargoes are really important because embargoes are a time frame when you're not allowed to access the content. So for example, you're going to subscribe to a new journal and there's a 1-year embargo. So what that means is that you will not have access it's a moving wall to the previous 12 months of content from that journal. So always make sure that you, when you get these title lists, when you're working with vendors to look at collections and packages, that you are aware of the embargoes on titles. Knowledge of the curriculum and knowledge of the collection, I'll put down here, are very, very important. You often need to, again, branch out, include other people in those. But the more you know about what people are doing on your campus, in your programs, the better off you're going to be in advising on collection development. Reporting access issues. So this whole slide is just to say, don't make it your email, right? You want to be able to create a ticketing system that exists outside of your email. Both of these are from SpringShare. The bottom one is LibAnswers. The one on the left, I think, is LibApps, maybe, I don't remember, but just think about how you can have a ticketing system for patrons to report issues. For one, if you have a team, this works really well, but you just don't want them to be living in your email. They're going to get buried. If you go on vacation, no one will answer them. So you just need to be asking and thinking about, how do patrons let us know when something isn't working? License negotiation is probably one of the most intimidating parts of being an ERL. But I want to say that if you just take the time to turn everything off, turn your email off, your phone off, and actually read a license, they're structured in a way that you'll be familiar with, like a scholarly article. There's clear definitions. There's headings that tell you what they're talking about, where you are. What I want to do, I mean, licenses, they range from 5 pages to 40 pages. Sometimes they have links out to websites, but there's 3 areas that you really need to focus on in a license. Authorized users. This is who is allowed to use the resource. And here you want to make it as broad as possible. They're usually going to have current faculty and current students. And you always want to try and stretch it out. Make sure that staff, other people at your institution can use it. What about retirees, emeritus retirees? What about visiting researchers, alumni, on-campus users and visitors? So pay close attention to the authorized users clause and try to make it as broad as possible. Permitted and prohibited uses. This is the second most important part, because you want access for your patrons. So you want them to be able to access information, download it, save it, and you want them to be able to use it in their publications. This sounds really basic. Just make sure you're reviewing what's allowed and what's not allowed when you look at a license agreement. And again, the great thing about license agreements is there will be a section titled permitted uses and prohibited uses. So really, if you just take the time, you'll be able to navigate them. Liability is the last one that I would mention, because you want to make sure that the library or your institution is not assuming liability that it shouldn't be. For example, what someone might do with the information, your job is to provide it and secure it, making sure that people have to authenticate before they can gain access to the resource, but you don't want to be responsible for what people may or may not do with it after that. So collection development funding, excuse me, and the most important thing to know here is that the same money is less money. So you're dealing most of the time with subscriptions. Yeah, you're going to buy some ebook packages, you're going to buy archives, you'll have perpetual purchases. But what you need to make sure that people in your institution, particularly your supervisor or people in the budget world, understand is that if you get the same money every year, you're actually being told to cut resources. Most resources will increase 4.5 to 5% or more every year. So the same money is less money. You're actually being told to cut. If you want to keep the same resources you have, you need a 5% increase on the budget every year. And if you want to do some serious collection development, you're going to need an increase even beyond that. So now you've done all this work to get these great resources, and how are you going to set them up, and how are you going to provide access? So this again is going to depend on the institution, but you're likely going to have an A to Z list, which is just a complete list of all of the databases and resources that your patrons have access to. A discovery service, this is going to depend on the institution as well, but you're going to need to figure out how to make these resources available via that discovery service. Make sure that resources are cataloged. You're probably going to work with a cataloging department. It depends. If you have an LSP, a library services platform, which we'll talk about in a second, you might be able to set it up yourself. And how remote access works, which is what we'll talk about right now. So remote access is really important, become even more important right now when a lot of people are moving to online only instruction. Easy proxy might be one that you've heard of. Open Athens, browser authentication, and VPN. So EasyProxy is an OCLC company, and what EasyProxy does is it makes off-campus people appear like they're on campus to the vendor. And so that's called a proxy server. It basically just routes you through that server and makes it look to the vendor like you're on campus. And so then you gain access to that. So this is location based, it's IP based. Open Athens, on the other hand, is person based. It's a little bit more individual. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from because it already identifies me as a person as being affiliated with the university. So you can access resources from anywhere. Browser authentication, you may have heard of things like Anywhere Access or Lean Library. These are ones where you've already authenticated in your browser session, and so you will have access to resources that your institution subscribes to. If they time out like after usually like 8 hours, or obviously if you use an incognito browser or clear history and cookies. And then a VPN is a virtual private network, which is basically like a tunnel between you and your university, which again makes it look like you're coming from the institution. This is an example of an easy proxy stanzas. These are freely available. You can go and check them out. This is what they look like. The one on the left is from ACS, American Chemical Society. And the one on the right is one I made up to make a resource work. They didn't have one. And so you can see, and you will learn this over time, but there's some standard things like basically just have a URL, some hosts, some domains, and then maybe some specific instructions that are commands that exist within the server. So you can build these yourselves, you can get them from OCLC, but it's a really kind of hands-on way to deal with off-campus authentication. So if you're preparing and you want to find work as an ERL, it's useful to know the most common and popular LSPs and ILSs. So integrated library, or LSP is Library Services Platform, and you can start looking at some of these, like for Alma, for example. All of their training documentation is freely available on the web. So while you might not be able to gain actual experience with Alma, you can do research on these and you can figure out a little bit on how they work, watch some tutorials. It's kind of hard to find e-resources positions that are entry level. So it's really good to build up as many skills and knowledge as you can, even if you haven't really managed resources in one of these systems. If you have a working knowledge of it, that'll be really helpful when you go through the interview process. Marketing, just a quick slide to say, finishing out the process. You've done all this work to get new resources. How are you going to let people know about it? Can you email students? Can you email faculty? Do you need to work through selectors? Is there a department that can help you with marketing? Can you put alerts on the website? Excuse me. So access assessment and renewal is a big part of the ERL's responsibilities. So we use Counter, which is a usage statistics standard. And this basically just means that you're comparing apples to apples. So if you look at ProQuest, Counter statistics, usage statistics are the same as when you compare them to EBSCOs. So the thing you need to know about Counter is it's a standard for usage statistics. You can also look at ILL data, see what's being borrowed at your institution and what your institution is borrowing. And then you want to look at percents of percents, which sounds really kind of silly and confusing, but here's a real example of a large journal package that we were renewing. And I wanted to know what percent of the journal of this package was being heavily used. It turns out the journals with 20 or more full text requests, we had 108 in this package of 2,500. So even though 1,500 had no uses whatsoever, it still would have been more expensive to subscribe to these 108 journals individually. So don't always just look at overall usage of a resource. Kind of dig down as far as you can to find out what's really being used inside of a package. Going along with the license agreement, you're not a lawyer, you probably aren't one, but you're going to be getting a lot of questions about copyright. The good news is there's more information than ever, either from the government or from Creative Commons licensing, to figure out, what you can do with fair use. What does the section 107 of the Copyright Act, which is the educational fair use section, what does it entail? I always encourage you to look for professionals and experts at your institution, but there might not be some. And so you might need to provide information to faculty and to students about what they can do in regards of copyright law. So if you do want to work as an e-resources librarian, this is from 2018, but you're looking mostly at academic institutions, so which is why I spend a lot of time talking about looking at the org chart, looking at the workflow of the institution so you can determine where you have the best chance of seeing these positions advertised and working. So, for job profiles and interviews, one thing to note when you look at a profile is that the less detail, possibly the more responsibility. And that will be a cue for you during the interview to ask a lot of really specific questions. You want to look at an org chart. If there's no systems librarian at that library, that's also likely going to be your part of your responsibilities to advising on the systems, setting up the systems, and dealing with those. You always want to talk about what additional responsibilities will be. How invoices is paid is kind of a silly one, but if you ask this question during an interview, you're going to get a lot of laughs from the people because it's so different in every institution, and you're going to be working with different criteria. Like when I was at the state institution, they had a bunch of different parameters and things that had to be met. You always want to ask how many systems are in place and what control you will have as the e-resources librarian over those systems. You want to talk about who deals with access issues and how. You want to make sure there's already a ticketing system in place. And if there's not, that they would be open to you establishing one. What kind of access do you have to the website? Can you put up alerts? Can you make changes to it? And then how do you communicate with patrons? Are you allowed to email people? Do they prefer that you work through people who have been assigned to departments? Do you have to get approval before sending emails? These are all things that are going to impact your work life, and dependent on what these answers are, could be a little bit more complicated than you would like. So you're going to be called a lot of names: computer librarian, IT person in the library, electric resources librarian, which is one of my favorites, professor of libraries, which is very nice, and chair of electric resources, and I think many more to come. A lot of times people aren't really sure what you do in the library, and so you will get a lot of strange requests and you'll be called a lot of different things. So I know we're right at the time. As I said, it was quick. I wanted to cover a broad overview, let you know kind of everything that might be involved. I'm going to take a look at the chat now. I understand if everyone has another session to get to, but this is my email address, and really do feel free to email me any questions you have, and I can get back to you. But right now, I'll be hanging out in the room if you do have questions, and I'll take a look at the chat as well. All right. So I'm just reading through some of these. If you want to jump in, oh, I don't know if you can even use your mic. Let me try reading them. Yeah, yeah. So talking about how, hosting locally is something that you can get into, but it is, it does take a lot of work, and it shifts a lot of responsibility to the library. Okay, so how do you approach license and individual vendor with individual vendors or distributors, especially those that may not have worked with the library for? So asking for specific terms. Okay, so one of the things, especially if you're going to be doing licensing and hosting on your own, is I always try to secure the perpetual license. The last thing that you need is to put a calendar reminder on your, Outlook calendar that 3 years from now you need to go back and negotiate a new license. I have found that a lot of I've probably dealt with not that many, maybe 3 or 4 independent production companies or producers, that they usually have a very simple license, and it basically just says that, they're selling you these rights for in perpetuity, so you can continue to host them as long as you keep them always behind your university's authentication system. Most vendors, which is very understandable, are just worried about, unlawful distribution of content, people being able to access content that they don't have the right to do. So the most important thing that I ask about is a perpetual license available, and then we draw up a license in terms of, what what assurances they might need. Okay. I see somebody from Georgia. I was at the University of West Georgia. That was my middle institution. Yeah, so checking with the campus attorneys for specific university wording. Yeah, so like one thing I'll say too is that when I went to work for the University of West Georgia, because it was a state institution, they had a lot of really specific guidelines for license negotiation, which made it a lot. I mean, to be honest with you, it made it a lot easier for me because those were that guidelines handed down from the state. But you'd be surprised at small institutions. I mean, they'll likely have an attorney or someone affiliated with the institution, but they're going to be asking you a lot of, even when I've worked with legal departments at institutions, there's stuff in there that doesn't really make sense to the legal department. And they kind of come back to you with questions like, what does this mean? Or what does that mean? And so you do want to try to find whoever it is. And you just want to make sure that you're not negotiating licenses yourself when you shouldn't be. But my experience is that people kind of hand it back to you and say, what do you think of it? What do you think we should agree to and not agree to? And so if there is that resource, then you definitely want to use it, but it might not always be there. And meanwhile, you have a stack of these piling up and a bunch of other work to get through. Okay, yeah. So I got kind of lucky getting into e-resources when I started as a technology assistant at a library, and the e-resources librarian there, I kind of just asked to work on projects with her, and I asked her if there was anything that I can help. So I definitely recommend getting your foot in the door at a library that has e-resources representation, a librarian, maybe a committee or something like that. And then you're going to find that you can start getting experience that way. After I had been there for about a year and a half, the e-resources librarian actually announced her retirement. And so I was able to apply for the position and get it. But I definitely understand it's very hard to break into. I only will see a few advertisements that are entry level for e-resources, and usually that's really just because there's no one there to train the person, and they're going to need someone that can hit the ground running. So my advice for that would be to try to get in at a library in an adjacent position, maybe where you can have some work with electronic resources. And then as you work with the e-resources librarian, you'll kind of be given more and more responsibilities. And then you'll also be able to, kind of showcase those yourself when you're looking for work. Right. So, right. So we're talking about Canopy. So yeah, we do have Canopy at Princeton University right now, and we've actually gone through. So the nice thing about a vendor like that is that they have a good admin portal for you. So you can log in and you can see. You can actually Canopy has a great admin portal because you can export all of your current licenses to a spreadsheet, and it will list all of the expiration dates like to the date. So it's kind of easy to keep track of when things are expiring. But you can purchase licenses for different lengths. So usually vendors will have a 1-year license, a 3-year license, or what we try to get as often as possible is a perpetual license. The problem with us wanting perpetual licenses is that right now we're at a time where budgets are tough. And so perpetual licenses understandably cost more. But we want to build kind of like a permanent video collection and not have one that is so flexible. But it's kind of a bad time to be doing that because we have been pushing for a while to have perpetual licenses to content, yet it's not a great time to be doing that. So we're buying a lot of 1-year licenses. We're 3-year if it's going to be part of a course reserve or if it's requested by a faculty member, and then perpetual if we know that it's something. And you can look at usage too. So like we were just renewing one the other day, and I saw that it was being requested the day after the license expired. And so I looked at last year's when we bought it and the year before. And so we're trying to get a perpetual license to that content because it's just so heavily used. We just makes sense to buy it permanently. Yeah. So another part of the question is, or another question that I just saw is that about working with other departments as well. Yeah, everybody, one of the things that you're going to work on a lot is just kind of like the whole siloed departments at your institutions, and the e-resources librarian really does kind of have the ability to work with a lot of different departments, because you're going to be working with the selectors, or they might be called subject specialists or library liaisons, to identify and evaluate content. You're going to work with the budget personnel to make sure that you can afford things. You're going to be working with the catalogers to make sure that everything is available. You're going to be working with the IT department when things don't work, or when you're setting up things in the beginning. And so I think that you want to, it's a good opportunity. It's going to be a lot of work, especially when you start a new institution, because you also have to learn basically the culture of all those silos. So if you're working with 4 different departments, you then have to learn how to work with each one of those. But it's also a great opportunity to have like a broad overview of how everything works. And a lot of times, when you work with finance departments, it's a little bit tricky too, because they like to have something received before they pay for it. And you're like, no, we started access last Monday. We already have it. It's not a physical thing. It's access to something, and that sometimes doesn't fit into the workflow that they have. And so you have to come up with very specific special ways to get things done. There's a lot of creativity involved in figuring out how to just get a patron access to information. It's amazing sometimes. Yeah, usage stats and the manual effort. So something that I've been trying to get better at is just putting, I don't know if there's vendors in here. It's just putting it back on the vendor, because you're right. Like if you have, so like maybe we have 750 vendors that we deal with right now, which equals tens of thousands of resources, and you're paying a lot of money. And a lot of times vendors have whole departments that can assist you with analysis, with usage statistics, and gathering them and comparing them. And they want to help you. They want to make sure that their resources are being used at your institution. So I've tried to get a little bit better recently, when I just haven't had the time to do them, to reach out to my sales rep and say, hey, listen, this is what we're really trying to figure out. Is there any way that you can help us with this? Because the worst that can happen is they're going to come back and say, no, we can't really do that. And then you're just right back where you started. And also it's going to depend. Yeah, some people are some chatting some more. So it's also going to, if you have an LSP, that library services platform, which is like an overarching management system like Alma, that you saw on the slide, they're also going to have some assessment tools. So you also always want to make sure that you know what assessment tools are available to you, and just ask your sales reps. Your sales reps are really, really, just essential resources. And because they want to make sure that you're happy with your product, they want to make sure that people at your institution are using it for their research. So I always recommend reaching out to them anytime you're talking about assessment, usage statistics, anything like that. Yeah, exactly. You may be able to download them yourself from an admin portal, but it's going to take a long time. And sometimes you're combining spreadsheets and you're having to clean them up so much. And it's almost, it's easier just to, oh yeah, so I can do, if I upload the slides, will people be able to get it after the session ends, Angie? Email me if you do want the slides, and I can just send them to you. If you can't, I'll upload them to the Pathable platform. But if you're not able to get them after the session ends, just send me an email, and I'll just email them back to you. And also, if you have any questions or like additional information, I think we get kicked out at 10 after. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up now. If I missed a question, I apologize. Just email me directly. And good luck to everyone. I hope you're having a good conference.